Iran and Trump. The clock is ticking. President Trump yesterday set off a new round of deadlines where he said in 2 weeks he's going to make up his decision about what he's going to do with Iran. Meanwhile, there's all kinds of speculation about, is it really a 2-week deadline? Is it really 2 weeks at all? Or is it just the delay of something else? All kinds of possibilities running rampant in there. And then there's also, as we keep talking about, some correlation and some bleed over between the Russia-Ukraine war and this war between Israel and Iran in more ways than you may think. A lot of things happening, and we're going to try to get to all of them. We got a great guy to do that today. Patrick Henningsen is back in the show, everybody. Geopolitical analyst, journalist, and host of the SundayWire.com. Patrick, as always, welcome back to the show. It's
great to be with you, Danny.
Hey, listen, let's just start off right at the top about this whole time clock thing. You might just kind of as a running start here. You know, Trump campaigned back as far back as 2023 on, I'm going to have this wrapped up in 24 hours. Then he changed it after he wanted to. I'm going to have it wrapped up before I assume office. Then it was like, all right, well, maybe 100 days. And then in April, it was, we're in the last few days, folks. That's going to be it. And then all of a sudden, you had, let's see what Keith Kellogg say. Well, it seems like that Rubio walked away from walking away. And then Trump said, all right, within a couple of weeks, we're going to know something. And then 3 weeks later, no one's talking about a deadline. And then all of a sudden, it looked like that Trump was ready to start bombing. And it looked for all the world like we were potentially 24 hours away. Lots of sources that I had said that was the case. And then all of a sudden, here's a new 2-week extension. What do you make of this 2-week period?
Well, if we go by award-winning journalist Seymour Hersh and what he published on his blog site today, he's saying that his sources are saying it's going to happen this weekend. That's a fait accompli. Now, Trump's statement was bifurcated. He said, "I've confirmed the operation, the military operation, but we're waiting 2 weeks." And look, if you're the Iranians, are you going to trust anything that Donald Trump says in public? Of course not, because the last time they lured the Iranians into complacency through negotiations, only to launch a sneak attack against them a week ago. So obviously the Iranians are going to take this with a pinch of salt, but there are a few clues to give a little credence to what Seymour Hersh has said. One of those is there is evidence that the United States are moving some equipment and personnel away from certain military facilities in the Middle East. Now, that's definitely a clue, but more likely, I think, Israel needs time to restock its air defense and missile defense batteries, its Iron Dome, so to speak. They need time to restock. The United States is the person who's going to be doing that. They need all sorts of coordination preparations because of the media blackout, Israel has taken a serious hit to a number of its military and intelligence and defense positions and facilities in Israel proper. So that's going to take time to sort out. They've got personnel issues. They've got logistical issues. But if you're Trump putting out this, flyer, if you will, that, maybe in 2 weeks, and then I wouldn't be surprised if he bombs this weekend. Now, I'm not happy about that. Nobody is. I hope that doesn't happen. But, and then the Europeans moving in, when they say the Europeans, who are the Europeans? Britain, France, Germany, all these countries support Israel to the hilt. And Kalia Kallas as well, that might be something up for discussion later, but that also looks like a bit of a ruse, because what leverage does Europe have? So it seems to me like there's a lot of games going on, and Trump's flip-flopping, as you said, Danny. He doesn't know where he's coming or going. He probably doesn't actually know whether he's coming or going. But someone's made a decision somewhere, whether that's coming from Tel Aviv or coming from whoever, has the ear of the president, whether that's the, Israel lobby or the, quote, deep state, whatever shape that's taking at the moment in Washington. But I can't, I don't believe a word this president says. So I almost factor that out of the equation. If anything, let's take a look at something here,
because when you're talking about what's going to happen here and what the United States is going to do, Netanyahu seems pretty confident that Trump is going to help him.
Is the United States going to come on board and help you with this?
I'm on the air.
That's a decision for the president to make, but I can tell you that they're already helping a lot, because they're participating in the protection of the skies over Israel and its cities with THAAD missile batteries that are in Israel, with Aegis ships that are on the shore of Israel, with their pilots that are fighting alongside our pilots to knock out drones. I think it's a remarkable cooperation.
Gary, I need to call a volatile here. Can I get you to come in and continue on with this conversation for a second? I'll be right back. Something's happening upstairs. I'll be right back.
Oh yeah, of course. Patrick, were you surprised how forthright he was in what he was just saying there, Netanyahu, and the cooperation that's going on?
Yeah, I think he's basically saying the quiet part out loud. The obvious is that this isn't not a U.S. Military operation. The United States is part and parcel with every single move, everything that the Israelis do. The only thing that the U.S. isn't doing is probably flying Israeli planes, and that's about it. Maybe some of the calls they're making in terms of strike packages or how they're coordinating over all these different airspaces to hit targets in Iran. Of course they're coordinating with the United States. The U.S. has eyes in the skies. The U.S. have rivets flying out of Qatar, hoovering up all the radar and communications data.
Yeah.
I mean, we've already shown that was the case from the first moment that Israel struck Iran. So to say that the U.S. isn't involved already, they're absolutely involved. And if you're involved on the defensive side, like knocking out drones and missiles, then of course that's the same as being involved in the war. So, and you have to remember, this is a war that Israel started. They waged an undeclared war of aggression against Iran. So the fact that the United States is backing them and not wanting to restrain them, or not saying, whoa, wait a minute, maybe we need to cool this down and both parties need to step back, we don't want a war. I don't see any of that talk coming out of Washington. So that's the problem here. That's the big problem. Nor are they talking about this in Europe either.
Well, a part of the game, it seems to me, what's coming out and what grabs the headlines is how Iran is so weakened at this point that there's no way that they're going to recuperate. They've already exhausted themselves. What's the next possible thing they could do? And that's the game that's being played, in the press and the media.
Well, look, it sounds interesting, and it almost sounds believable for a moment. And then you just have to set your mind back about a month, maybe a month and a half, and the United States went all guns blazing against Yemen, against not even the full modern military Yemen, the Ansar Allah, the Houthis. And they waged a 7-week air campaign, bombing all sorts of targets in Yemen. And basically they had to kind of withdraw from that after 7 weeks or so. So I think Iran is stronger by orders of magnitude to Yemen. I mean, that's not even up for discussion. So if Yemen gave the United States even a little bit of a problem, you can multiply that times 100, and that's the sort of problem that Iran is going to give the United States on their good day, on the U.S. good day. So, I mean, I don't believe a lot of what I'm seeing in the U.S. media. It sounds so lopsided. Everything is Israel is just, cleaning up, and right. Iran's basically. But we've been through this before with Ukraine, so I want to believe the coverage, but then I have to be skeptical because there's a pattern that we all recognize.
And let me ask you, and thanks, Gary, for filling in there. I just had a situation needs to be taken care of. Live TV. The issue here is that's always talked, or it's talked about a lot right now, is who has the most missiles, or better question, who's going to run out first? And of course, it depends on who you ask. Some people say that they only had Iran only had like a couple thousand, and so they're already getting close to the end. And others says no, they have like 20 or 30,000. Obviously, I have no earthly idea what to say in between, but that does seem really decisive about who can keep going the longest, because as I see it, you tell me if you see it any differently, that it doesn't matter whether it's Iron Dome, THAAD, Patriot ad infinitum, all that, or whatever, the S-300, S-400 on the other side. Both sides have missiles that the other side's not going to intercept. So whoever has the most missiles can continue going the longest. So I got something to follow on. But first of all, what is your belief, is it, or best you can understand, about who has the most missiles and how many does each side have?
I'm like you, Danny. I don't know. I've heard estimations on the Iranian side of more than 100,000 of various grades and types and specs. And on the low end, 4,000 or something like that. But even if it's on the low end, and it is in fact 4,000, it's not 10 or 20, you're still looking at a protracted conflict here. And the other thing is that what Iran's done is it's raised the cost. It's raised the cost of this conflict for Israel. It's also raised the cost for the United States, because the United States and Israel are joined at the hip. So any problems Israel has politically, public image-wise, whether they're winning or losing this, or militarily, the United States has that problem as well, because they are working together. They are absolutely intertwined and intermeshed in everything they do. So this is a big advantage for fighting proxy wars. And this also puts to bed any speculation of whether this is a proxy war or not. It's so obviously a proxy war, just like Ukraine is a proxy war. The West, NATO, and the U.S. are fighting Russia with Ukraine. Here they are clearly fighting Iran. The United States is absolutely using, Israel's taking a pounding for the United States. It's absolutely in the interests of the U.S. for this war to carry on. This looks like a strategic objective of the United States, to have regime change.
Yeah, and it's funny. It's like I'm not sure whose objective. I don't know if it's Donald Trump's or somebody else's. We can certainly go down that path here. But let me take a look at the diplomatic level, because the Iranian side asked for a meeting of the National Security Council, the UN National Security Council meeting in today, and the Iranian ambassador kind of gave a preview of what he wanted to talk about and where they stand.
Definitely, if United States is going to involve in the aggression against Iran, it will receive firm and resolute response. Iran will show no any doubt, no any hesitation, no any reluctance in defending the people, in defending our integrity, in defending our country, and in defending the humanity, because what we are doing is to defend international law, to defend humanity. Our military forces are monitoring the activities of the United States, and there is a red line set for the United States. If the United States cross that line, the response will come.
Now, I played that in particular because there's dueling narratives. You talked about this a second ago. That's the Iranian side, and they say, we've been attacked. This is about humanitarian issues. This is about international law. They claim Israel has violated that. And then you had the Israeli ambassador, Danny Danon, give a slightly different take. Sorry, Gary's got to cue that one up a little bit. Sorry about that. Just a second. Here we go.
Iran is not under attack. Iran is being stopped. On Wednesday evening, it launched a ballistic missile directly at Soroka Hospital in Beersheba, in the southern part of Israel. It is the largest hospital in the region. Soroka Hospital serves more than 1 million civilians of all backgrounds. This was a war crime, deliberate, indiscriminate, and barbaric. Israel's actions have been precise and compliant with international law. Our targets are military. Our objective is clear: to dismantle the Iranian regime's genocidal capabilities before it is too late.
That's good enough right there, Gary. So a lot to unpack there. But first of all, what do you make of his opening statement there that Iran is not under attack?
And that Israel's abiding by international law, waging undeclared wars of aggression. That's, I guess that's the highest crime you can possibly commit in international law. So I don't know what he's talking about, but that's from the world's most moral army there. And by the way, Soroka Hospital, the hospital he's talking about, it wasn't targeted directly. It wasn't even hit directly. What it was, it does appear that Iran was targeting a intelligence facility, which is right next to Soroka Hospital, and then the blast caused damage at that hospital. So again, do you trust? Does anybody believe anything the Israelis say? This is a government, mind you, that has targeted and destroyed over 40 hospitals and medical facilities in Gaza, and not only that, have killed doctors, medical workers, EMS responders, and in some cases, according to the UN Rapporteur on Human Rights, even tortured some doctors and medical workers after they've captured some of these hospitals. So they're just not credible, the Israelis. So it's it's more common.
But the reality of it is, when he makes statements like that, he knows that there's folks like you and I that are going to call this out, and he's just going to say it's a blatantly untrue, and here is the truth, here physically is it. But I think their target audience is those who are already passionate believers in the West, and especially in the United States and Great Britain, because they will eat this up and they will repeat it ad nauseum, because they will never look at the other side, all these other pieces of information. And I think that they make those statements, decide how absurd it is on face value, but they could care less on that. They just want to reinforce their core believers because, and you tell me what you observe, I think they're bleeding a lot of core believers, and a lot of people are drifting away because it's getting too much, too contrasty between what's being said and what's being observable on their screens.
Yeah, not only that, a lot of the news reports for this hospital, they would put other footage that wasn't of the hospital itself. That was a common thing on social media that I've seen in terms of the information warfare with Israel. So there's no journalistic standards. Not all that's out the window. It's just literally waves and waves of information. And they're trying to move the dial in terms of public opinion. So I don't know. It's like you said, Danny, they're talking to their core audience, which in the United States are, whoever's supporting Donald Trump and supporting this effort, and other elected officials. So it's the earlier statement though by Iran is much more interesting. You notice how measured they are, how careful they are, how precise they are, and they're completely not over the top. This isn't Baghdad Bob that we saw 22 years ago. This is different, and that says a lot about the Iranian government, which we call the quote regime. Who's acting like a regime and who's acting like a government at this point?
Yeah, well, hey, I think that speaks for itself there. I want to circle back around to something you said at the top of the show here. You're talking about this Seymour Hersh piece. Now, at least as far as I saw when it came out, that was written and published either right before or right after Trump made this 2-week thing. So the question was going to be, because Seymour Hersh has sometimes been prescient, like nobody's business, has uncovered stuff that nobody knew, and he's been pretty wrong on a few big issues too over the years. So like anybody, you got to take and examine the facts as you can get it. But do you see any other corroborating information that would suggest that Trump's 2 weeks was not a change in whatever Hersh had been reporting? And the reason I ask this is because some of the sources that I had queried prior to Trump making that statement were in line with what Hersh was saying, and they were dumbfounded too, and they were blindsided, thinking, "Wow, well, something dramatically changed because now all of a sudden it's not coming." Because there was some thought it was going to come that night, and then obviously it hasn't since. At least the U.S. involvement. What do you make of all this?
Well, you have to remember, Danny, this precedes the big media talking point of who has more missiles left. How long can Israel last? 10 to 12 days. How long can the Iranians last? And it just so happens Trump says, "Oh, we're going to wait 2 weeks." Why 2 weeks? Why not 1 week? Why not a month? No, to restock, perhaps, because this is clearly a problem for Israel. So that could be a clue there. Is Hersh accurate? Is this dependable? Not sure. But the contents of it, though, is even more interesting. Is that they're saying that the supreme leader, Khamenei, needs to go. Everything will be fine as soon as he goes. So that's clearly the policy is regime change there. And the other thing was about J.D. Vance heading up some of these working groups, whereby they're talking about replacing the supreme leader with a moderate religious leader, and then there's an argument between the American side and the Israelis. The Israelis want a political puppet. They say they don't care about the religious aspect of it as well. So that certainly was interesting. There could be a lot of truth in that, and that gives us a bit of a signal as to what the priorities are. But it's clearly regime change. So this is interesting. If this is about press and about putting out information for public consumption, then it creates a sub-argument, which is, well, okay, we're going to do regime change, but are we going for a political puppet or a moderate religious leader or we're going to put Al Qaeda in charge, like we did in Syria. So it creates a new public segue for discussion. So look, all of this is information warfare in terms of leaks, in terms of disclosures. The whole Tulsi Gabbard controversy, I don't know how much of that is actually theater and how much of that is real. It's very difficult to tell because Trump, it is all about theatrics and WWF, fake fights and things like this. So it's really hard to
Fair
take
enough. We got to take it
seriously.
by, but in addition to, see, sometimes I'm less inclined to go down that path because there would have to be like a 3D chess mind behind it to be able to choreograph stuff, and I don't see one of those. So I don't know, but that's just my guess. But let me tell you one thing I do see though is that there's some folks that ain't the sharpest pen in the drawer, if I can be kind here. There was if you still have this available in the Wall Street Journal, there was a piece by retired 4-star General Wes Clark, who was a former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. And he put up with his idea about, listen, hey, we don't have to be military all the time. Let's give peace a chance. And his definition of peace, I'm not making this up. I'm not just reading between the lines. These are the lines here. Mr. Trump, he wrote, has the leverage to achieve a 2-track approach, a diplomatic solution that would defang the regime. Mr. Trump could require Iran to stop all its nuclear efforts, give up uranium enrichment permanently, renounce its aims to destroy Israel and the U.S., end its hegemonic aspirations, and cease supporting terrorism. In return, because, if it's a diplomacy, you got to give something to get something. In return, the U.S. wouldn't destroy Iran with military force. Well, now there's a package that anybody would really think long and hard about accepting. But I mean, that kind of is just, that's not even delusion. In my view, that's just like comedy.
That's Wesley Clark is basically reiterating what Trump's putting out on True Social, unconditional surrender. That's basically what he said there. But all of this conversation, all of this predicated on fake presumptions about Iranian nuclear weapons, and there's clearly no evidence that anybody, including our intelligence community in the United States, has that Iran has or is actively pursuing nukes. So that puts the time horizon at least 12 months, maybe more. Not only that, you have all of the other co-sponsors and people who were stakeholders in the JCPOA as well. They're not coming out waving intelligence briefings about Iran's nukes. This is all coming out of Tel Aviv and Trump's head. He was confronted by a CNN reporter. Do you believe your DNI's assessment that Iran doesn't have a nuke and is not pursuing a nuke? And Trump says, I don't care what she says. I have my own idea. I just have a hunch. Trump has a hunch. He can see with his X-ray vision underground in the below, 50 meters below and four-door, and he knows what's going on there. I think it's more like somebody is in his ear, and we kind of have a good idea
Patrick,
of who that
somebody
is.
who doesn't have to worry about using their X-ray vision is the IAEA. I think it was Secretary General, who this morning released a statement that completely corroborated what Tulsi Gabbard said back in March, where he says there is no nuclear weapons program. The Supreme Leader has said, he literally just almost parroted what she said. And he said, look, we have plenty of room for negotiated settlement. Iran is willing to negotiate. They're willing to give in on some things, et cetera. We don't have to use military force for this. So that completely undercuts what Netanyahu said, that they have firm evidence that they had made the decision. Yet the guy on the ground who has been critical of Iran, it's not like he's a pro-Iranian guy, but he said, no, they don't have a nuclear weapons program, which shreds the whole justification for this alleged attack, which even by itself, and if you want to comment on this, go ahead, even if what they said was true, that doesn't justify under any kind of international law the authorization to attack another country because they might have been moving in that direction. What do you say?
Absolutely, Danny. And not only that, you don't want to attack that country in the middle of negotiations. We have to remember, and this is the problem with Trump. It's literally flood the zone with chaos, and people forget the simplest, most basic things. They're in the 6th round of negotiations with the Iranians about a nuclear deal. And Trump had said, we want 0 enrichment. And then they say, no, we're willing to do 3. And they say, Trump tweets out, we've agreed on 3. It's all signed and sealed and delivered by Monday. And all of a sudden, big pivot, a U-turn on Monday. No, we forget that. We want zero enrichment. And the next thing you know, it's like, oh, yeah, we're close to a deal, and then Israel attacks. So they were in the middle of negotiations, and then after Israel kills the counterparts in the negotiations on the Iranian side, and then Trump is boasting about it on social media. So I think the diplomatic route is pretty much dead and buried as far as the Iranians will not take the United States seriously. They're going to, much like the Russians, in the stoic fashion, they're going to go and do what they need to do. But in fact, what the Israelis and Donald Trump have done, they've made the argument for the hardliners in Iran, and there are hardliners in Iran. They've already made their argument of why they should have a nuclear deterrent. If anything, the events of the last week have firmed that argument up within Iran to the point where even moderates are now considering discussing that. So was that the plan of Israel and the United States, to push Iran further down the road, pull back now, and then come back and hit them hard when they've developed a nuclear weapon or withdrawn from the NPT? Who knows? But right now we're at a real threshold of the region going up in flames, and who knows? This is totally new territory for Israel and for the U.S. This is the first time the United States has faced potentially an adversary that is able to hit back.
Yeah.
And hit back accurately, and that's not a small thing. So
No,
all of the doctrines, all of the handbooks, all of the experience of the Joint Chiefs, they don't have any experience with this.
And you mentioned the Russians a minute ago. That's another fly in the ointment's not strong enough. Like another stick in the middle of all this, or something in the jamming up the cogs, and that is the Russian aspect of this. So Vladimir Putin, I think it was yesterday, was asked at a conference what he thought about the situation with Iran, because they had some agreements with Iran, which is apparently not like an Article 5 type military agreement. They had some other types of agreements, but the question was, are you just going to walk away and leave Iran to its fate? And Putin said this.
Allow me for a very direct question about the situation.
No, sorry, Gary, not
Trump.
that one, the other one.
Благодаря усилиям, значит.
Yeah, sorry, not that one either. The one about Bashir. We have a lot of Putin shots today.
И были эти контакты. Я думаю, что завтра, послезавтра будет. Мы продолжаем наши отношения. Это первое. А второе, я уже об этом сказал. Наши специалисты работают в Бушере. 250 человек, и еще командированные. Общая численность может достигать 600. И мы не уходим.
So if you have allegedly set as one of your, maybe not even one of, but your objective is to destroy the Iranian nuclear program, then if Russia is parked in Bashir and he's basically taunting them and saying, you want to do it? Then you're going to potentially drag me into the war because I ain't leaving. In fact, I might even put more people inside this facility. What do you make of that?
Well, we do know that Moscow has had back channels or discussions with Israel on this very issue, and we're led to believe that Israel has guaranteed that Russian workers or staff or engineers or whoever that team is will not be put in harm's way. That's the impression we got from the Russian media. However, he's not saying we're going to evacuate all our people. This is the thing with Russia. Russians they don't like not fulfilling their contracts, and they have a contract with the Iranian government. And as you can see, it's more than just a contract. President Putin sees that joint project as the international relations between Iran and Russia. That's the basis of international relations between those two countries. That is not a small thing, considering these two countries are planning a north-south trade corridor and energy corridor to connect with Mumbai via the Indian Ocean. So they're big plans. This is all part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but this is more on the Russian and Iranian end of it. This is not a big thing. This is the future. Sorry, this is not a small thing. This is the future of these two countries' economies and geopolitics. So the seriousness of Putin, you could see it on his face. He is, I would not be surprised if Russia, if this is a signal, Russia will move more assets into Iran.
And what do you think would have happened, or is maybe a better question? Is Putin signaling our people are there? You've said you want to go after this nuclear side, but if you take this one out and you get any of my people in the process, then Russia could potentially, at least in maybe more indirect ways, participate with this. What is the signal here from Moscow?
Well, I think Vladimir Putin, if he wanted to participate, he could participate on the same level that the United States is already participating in defending Israel against incoming. Okay, and there's a lot of airspace that can be that Iran needs help to protect, and certainly any Russian assistance in that regard to protect Iran would not be out of the bounds of international norms. In fact, it would be they're duty bound in the international system. There are there's things that are made available for countries to take that choice if a country is a victim of an undeclared war of aggression, which Iran is clearly by international law. So Russia would not be violating any treaties or international principles by coming to help defend Iran.
Which is the same logic we've used in Ukraine. We said, yeah, Russia invaded, so we can help you and all this stuff. So question is what's good for the goose, good for the gander? I guess we'll be finding out.
These are not separate issues now, see, because if the United States goes full bore on this with Iran, I think they're really weakening their position in Ukraine, almost like letting it go. Because not only that, what it's going to require, this is not going to be an overnight thing. This is going to be protracted. Iran is not going to wave the white flag. At least that's the impression I get. So if it's going to be a long affair, even if it's going to be a few months, that you're talking about depleting everything, every single Patriot missile battery around Kiev, around Odessa, Kharkiv. Russia then has, control of the airspace over most of Ukraine, and the United States is a much weaker hand in any potential negotiations, and that's it. So, I mean, and this is interesting because the United States is being pulled by Israel. First, they were pulled by Ukraine. Now they're being pulled by Israel. And the United States is losing here, losing there. It's like death by 1,000 cuts for the U.S. This is exactly how the British Empire folded, by the way. They couldn't manage.
Yeah, too many analogies there. Let's go ahead and go down that path, though, on the Ukraine side here, because there are some definite correlations and connections, which we're going to see here in a second. First of all, I want to look at Kaja Kallas, who is trying to pick up the slack from any lack of U.S. support by seeing if they can bring European support.
Last year, Russia spent more on defense than the European Union combined. This year, Russia is spending more on defense than its own healthcare, education and social policy combined. This is a long-term plan for a long-term aggression. You don't spend that much on military if you do not plan to use it.
Okay, man, that last part of the statement there I thought was really painful because I'm going, hang on, Kaja, are you sure you want to go down that and make that draw? Because you're saying that if you spend that much money on defense, you're going to use it, but you just announced a build up in European deal in the $800 billion and everybody jump up to 5%. What is that signaling to Russia? Because if you don't build something unless you plan on using it, what's the lesson for Russia?
Or if you're looking for consistency in any of these speeches by the European Union representatives, especially Kaja Kallas, then you're not going to find it. So she's contradicting herself, and this is what the Europeans are constantly doing on this. So Russia has been attacked. The difference between Europe and Russia is Russia's been hit inside Russia. Not only that, it's had its nuclear deterrent targeted and hit as well. So from a Russian point of view, this is an existential issue. They have an imperative now to really kind of double up, mobilize more of their economy, and they're doing it in a very calculated fashion. In fact, they've been doing it since 2014. And it's so funny that it's not actually true. I think Europe is probably spending more than Russia in terms of defense, but if you go by relative purchasing parity, maybe Russia is spending more, but in terms of just raw GDP with euros versus rubles, I think Europe's probably spending way more now. But what are they getting for it? You know, what's going to happen that the longer this situation with Europe and Russia and Ukraine gets drawn out, Europe, 5 to 10 years before they can rearm, and then even then, what experience do they have in the field? Unless they just, you know, borrow it from Ukraine. But Ukraine's not going to be officially in NATO. I think that's pretty much off the table. So what are we looking at for Europe? 15, 20 years? Will it ever happen? Will they ever be an interoperable, effective military force? Really? Probably not. You know,
that assumes that their economies will facilitate it. But it's interesting though, because when asked on a similar related topic, Vladimir Putin does not shy back from saying that they are building their military power.
Благодаря усилиям, значит, западных союзников Украины, они выбросили эти договоренности в помойку, как я говорил, и решили воевать с нами до последнего украинца и до полной стратегической победы. Этого не получается, и поэтому мы вместо мирных договоренностей на этот счет вынуждены с помощью вооруженных сил добиваться решения этой задачи, а именно демилитаризации. Мы не допустим, чтобы на Украине были вооруженные силы, которые угрожают в перспективе Российской Федерации и ее народу. Вот эти удары и видели ваши журналисты. И, безусловно, если мы не договоримся мирным путем, мы будем добиваться поставленных целей военных.
That was 2 days ago, and unfortunately, that didn't get much notice even in the Western press because everybody's focused on Israel for obvious reasons. But that was a really strong statement that we will accomplish our mission, and that mission means the demilitarization of Ukraine, either by peaceful means with this negotiated settlement, which will include a voluntary withdrawal from certain areas and a demilitarization and people leaving this force, or it will be imposed from the outside. Is that just bluster from Putin, or can he make it happen?
I think they're already making it happen, and I think even this morning it might have been at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, but he was asked, you know, would you require Ukraine to surrender? And he said, no, we don't want an unconditional surrender from Ukraine. What we want from Ukraine is, we'll talk to Ukraine, but what we really want is a recognition of realities on the ground.
And as a matter of fact, we have that clip for those who may have missed it. Go ahead and run that, Gary.
Allow me for a very direct question about the situation. Donald Trump is seeking what he calls the total surrender of Iran in terms of the nuclear project. Would Vladimir Putin seek the total surrender of Volodymyr Zelensky in the same thing?
First of all, it's not the same thing. It is a very different situation. And secondly, we are not aiming for unconditional Kurd surrender by Ukraine. We insist that Ukraine recognizes realities that we have on the ground.
So that was an interesting exchange because, you know, Putin kind of hesitated for a minute because he's very thoughtful anyway. But then he was pretty short with the answer. Not the same situation. We're not looking for that. We just want realities on the ground. Question into it. So then it went on to something else. So he was not going to elaborate. What did you make of that exchange?
Yeah. As you can see, he's of another class politically on an intellectual level. I think far beyond his European counterparts. Maybe not so far from his Asian counterparts. They seem to be a lot more canny in their discussions and dialogues. But this is an important point because the United States was very close to recognizing realities on the ground. It seemed like that at the beginning of the conversation with the Trump team and the Russians and a lot of the theatrics in the White House. And then things started to drift away from that. And then we drifted into this weird gray zone, which we're currently in right now. So I think this is now Russia speaking directly. It's almost like he's saying the Americans have basically ballsed it up. And now this is another chance to reach out with an overture to the Ukrainians saying, you guys, you know, the United States isn't necessarily going to be backing you to the hilt or not in the way that you might want in the long term. we're sending you out a signal here. You need to come to the table and recognize reality. And it's going to be a slow process, and Russia's fully aware
Let me ask you, though. I mean,
yeah.
he said point blank, I'm not looking for the unconditional surrender, but kind of isn't he? Because he's asking him to voluntarily withdraw from territory they currently possess and to voluntarily reduce the size of his armed forces, probably by a factor of 5 or so, based on what some of the Russian members of parliament have been saying over the last several months. So he's kind of asking him to do that because Zelensky is totally detached from reality and has no ability to do anything that Russia. He's still demanding NATO, for crying out loud. So, I mean, whether that's the words that Putin's using, isn't that the net effect, though, don't you think?
It is the net effect, Danny, but it's also you're talking about Eurasia, Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine's slightly Eurasian. So what Russia's doing is giving him a chance to save face a little bit, or giving the Ukrainians a little bit of space to save face. In other words, we're not going to publicly demand your unconditional surrender and humiliate you. Here's another opportunity to take a step towards us. So this is a very Asian thing, giving them an opportunity to do that. Maybe, I don't think it's available right now, quite frankly, but only the winning side could get away with even saying such things. So that kind of shows you Russia's position. Seems very confident. That's a very confident position that Russia's in, to be able to make a statement like that. Whereas Trump, you look at the bluster on Truth Social with the Iranians, it's not necessarily a strong position that he's in. He's putting up a strong front. You see the difference between the two leaders. One puts up a big front and the other doesn't. One walks and speaks softly but carries a big stick. The other speaks loudly and doesn't seem to know where he's waving his stick half the time. So I think it's an interesting exercise looking.
Well, you know who else has confidence, and probably for the same reason, that's Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, who was interviewed by a British reporter who was asking some pretty frank questions. And again, you talk about the difference in statecraft between the Russians and the Europeans. It's going to be on display here again, because Peskov's pretty confident, but still tries to keep it professional. First of all, he was asked, what Trump said he was trying to get, what the Europeans said they want, what Zelensky said he was trying to get was a unconditional 30-day ceasefire, and yet the Russians haven't done it. And the British reporter asked him, why not?
So you're concerned about Ukraine rearming, regrouping in a ceasefire?
We're concerned about Ukraine being pumped up by new armaments and so on and so forth, thus getting prepared for another offense.
Wouldn't Russia do exactly the same? Use a ceasefire to rearm and regroup and move its forces around?
If the same is done, then there is no need for ceasefire. Now we have a strategic advantage. Why should we lose it? We're not going to lose it. We're going further, we're advancing, and we'll continue to advance.
Pretty point blank and straightforward.
Well, it's like you said, Danny, it kind of is terms of surrender, but they're not overtly saying it. You can't make such statements like Peskov there unless you're absolutely in the driving seat. But the United States and the Europeans, for public relations and political reasons, for their own constituencies in their respective countries, they can't admit that that is the true state of affairs. So you have this whole theater, this facade going on in Europe and between Europe and Washington, pretending that the conflict is going really well, and Ukraine just did this gallant, daring raid against the Russian long-range bombers and the drones, and the genius of it all. And also, listen, defense stocks in Europe are pumping right now. They're making a lot of money. And so that's also what's fueling all of these summits, these conferences, these agreements. These people are really high on the defense industry right now, especially in Europe. And this is, great for them. But it's funny though, and this was in that piece in Responsible Statecraft recently, just giving a sketch of the situation, is all the old NATO doctrines are predicated on this concept of that there's going to be this great undergirding of an economy in Europe that's going to fuel all this innovation and utility in terms of their defense prowess. Where is that economic undergirding? I don't see it. So they didn't factor that in. So it's a totally different thing going on here. And so again, a lot of it is theater. There's a lot of money to be made, but in terms of actual, abilities and capabilities militarily, facing off against the Russians. Maybe they're blowing a lot of hot air in Europe at the moment and making a lot of money while they're blowing the hot air, but they have no intention of actually fighting Russia in the long run. That could also be possible.
I think that's the case. I think the bluster will stop when it comes to blood of theirs. We'll see how that works out. One other exchange during that same interview I wanted to show because it was really telling. We talked about earlier in this episode here of Danny Dannon, the diplomat for Israel at the United Nations. And we said, the stark and grotesque double standard that he said, what he claimed his opponents was doing, et cetera. Well, this reporter thought he caught Dmitry Peskov in a similar kind of double standard, but watch how he handled it.
We have a conflict with Ukraine, and we would prefer to solve our problems through peace negotiations. And until we don't have this chance at hand, we're going to continue our military operation.
Russia urging others to show restraint. Isn't that hypocritical of Russia, given that Russia's been waging war on its neighbor for more than 3 years? Isn't that a bit rich, coming from Vladimir Putin?
Oh, I don't think so. I don't think so. No.
Why not? You've been dropping bombs on your neighbor for more than 3 years. How is that?
We're dropping bombs on his military, on our neighbor's military infrastructure, because we have to get him deprived of military potential.
How is that setting an example of de-escalation, showing restraint?
There are different reasons. Not a military bloc was trying to infiltrate Iran to get closer to Israel, thus constituting a threat to Israel. And NATO military infrastructure was getting inside Ukraine, thus getting closer to our borders, and proclaiming the ultimate goal of swallowing up Ukraine, thus being next to our borders and then deploying military infrastructure. We couldn't afford that.
So you might want to be careful before you think you're going to embarrass the Russian side in one of these things here. But he makes some pretty good points.
He is very slow and deliberate too. And I just thought maybe the reporter may have just stumped him there, but he didn't. Slowly and pragmatically, he made his point. And Dmitry Peskov makes the great point there about the NATO factor. But there's other points in there which all of these Western journalists will always basically gloss over. And one of those is Russia was mounting what the West would call and have called and have gone to war under a banner of responsibility to protect, and not just R2P far away, halfway across the world, like Obama and Samantha Power will wax lyrical about for 8 years. No, R2P with your next door neighbor, and a former republic within the Soviet Union system in Donbass and Lugansk, which were being attacked by the Ukrainian military that were being armed to NATO standard by the United States and other NATO countries, killing civilians, shelling them for 8 years, which caused a crisis that led to a UN Security Council resolution 2202, the Minsk Accords that was mandated to be implemented, mandated by the great powers. And they all basically allowed the thing to lapse, sandbagged it, sabotaged it, because it seemed like they didn't want to have peace. And Russia was on board with the Minsk peace process. They kept their phones and their doors open till the very last moment. The contact group in Moscow, I spoke to them personally last time I was in Russia. They never gave up. In fact, their phone is still on the line of communication with the Ukrainians. They haven't closed the office. The contact group for the Minsk is still active. There's just nothing going on because Ukraine's not doing it. But this is so typical Russia. Once they decide on a path, they'll stick to it. They'll honor their commitment diplomatically, legally, and internationally. But what you have is the West have not honored their commitment. None of these journalists want to bring this up. It's almost like Putin just magically rolled over on the wrong side of the bed on February 24th, 2022, and just decided I'm going to take over Europe, and Ukraine is going to be my first conquest. That's kind of the dumbed down, basic narrative that a lot of these journalists are working on. And that's why at some point, the Russians just can't take the Western press seriously.
Yeah, and of course that's being fed to them by all these senior leaders. I mean, all these opinion makers and opinion leaders in the United States, former generals, former members of the ambassadorial staff, et cetera. And of course, the Keir Starmers, Emmanuel Macron, Schultz when he was there, Merz now. I mean, they say that stuff all the time. That Russia's coming to the West, and only we got to stop them here, because otherwise they'll definitely it's Hitler all over again. It's always 1938 somewhere, and we just have what we have. But I think that all this stuff, whether we're talking about the Israeli-Iranian situation, whether the U.S. is going to just make it even worse for ourselves by getting involved, I certainly hope that doesn't happen. But the way I see it, and kind of your last question here, my last question here of you is, it seems to me that we are making so many unforced errors that we are continually degrading our own future security in the process. And if we don't change pretty quick, we may unwittingly undercut our own future. How do you see it?
I think this is absolutely the case. I also think it's even more dangerous now today than it was 2 weeks ago, because what the United States, I don't know if these people realize what they have just done with regards to the Iranian nuclear negotiations, in terms of the United States being able to present itself as a credible negotiations partner. It was already tenuous before that, but by virtue of the fact that Donald Trump tore up the JCPOA after his first year in his first term, and then comes in and sort of demands a new deal, and then turns into an unconditional surrender deal, and then it turns into a regime change operation. It's like, what kind of a message is the U.S. sending to the Iranians, to any other potential negotiating partners, to Russia, to China? Should a crisis break out with Taiwan, is the United States trustworthy in the international arena? You know what else? This is another important lesson here, okay? It also goes to show Trump, the deal maker. He's advertised, I can make a deal. Obama failed because he was a terrible negotiator, and I'm not, and so I'm going to be able to solve all these problems around the world. You know what? In international relations, there's a reason why you have multiple countries involved to glue an agreement together, to guarantee an agreement, because often in the international system, bilateral agreements and negotiations aren't effective for the nature or the fact that governments change, especially in the so-called liberal democratic West. They change every 4 or 5 years, and so policies could change, and radical changes in interests, national interests. So Donald Trump thinking that he can go it alone, that he himself or the U.S. government alone unilaterally is going to determine, because they're the superpower. This is degrading the entire international system, and a very delicate framework that was built up and was sustained over 80 years after the Second World War. Republicans and Democrats have worked in that system since the Second World War. So to say this is a partisan issue, I think is not true, but this is how it will be framed in the United States. And Israel, by the way, does a lot in terms of pushing the talking points about nationalism and populism, and the U.S. shouldn't be ashamed of its world power and so forth. So it seems like these are the last two actors in the international system that don't want to abide by any international law or be accountable to anyone other than themselves. And that is a recipe for disaster, history has shown.
It has indeed, and you can walk that for a while, but everything's got an end. Everything expires at some point, and I think that's wearing pretty thin right now. Well, listen, we really appreciate you coming on today and sharing your thoughts here. And just to remind everybody, you got the 21stCenturyWire.com and the Sunday Wire every Sunday with host Patrick Henningsen. Be sure and check that out. Always got great stuff, because I know people don't get enough of you here, so you've got stuff there to go find. So recommend anything you want to say about what's coming up this Sunday.
No, we'll be talking about this. I hope we're still going to be here. Firstly, as a planet, and if we are, we'll be talking. Hopefully, that Donald Trump hasn't begun air campaign against Iran. I'm praying for this. I'm praying for the safety of all people in Iran and the Middle East, everywhere. And I'm praying that the White House somehow is listening to its better angels on this issue. So I'm not giving up hope. However, if it does happen, then it's depressing, quite frankly, Danny, because 22 years ago we had the situation right before the Iraq War. And, it's really difficult. I'm getting a lot of deja vu, as a lot of you are and a lot of people are.
Yeah,
and
we've been talking about that earlier.
It's tough. It's really tough. So, but you have to be an optimist. You have to be an optimist no matter what. And otherwise, what's the point of
like we said in our show earlier today, until a bomb starts falling, until its airstrikes start getting launched, there's still a chance that we can do the right thing. And that's what we also hope for.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Patrick. We really appreciate it. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time you're here. And we'll look forward to seeing you guys next time on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.